You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 13. Dilemma. The police eventually arrived, and Mark tried to explain about his kidnapping, Michael's blackmailing, the two bodies they'd find, and the two villains on the run. This was all too much for the two officers concerned, who promptly radioed for assistance. By the end of that day, both men had poured out most of the unlikely story to the officers interviewing them at Cambridge Parkside Police Station. Mark gave the telephone numbers from memory they should call in order to sort things out enough to have him to leave. They wanted Michael to remain to explain all the details he knew about the gang, since in their eyes he may be one of them. Absolutely no mention about a possible A-bomb in the bowels of the Kremlin, nor Secret Service involvement left their lips. They'd come to that agreement during their long trek to find a phone. Anyway, they wouldn't have believed a word. That part of the affair would have to be sorted out a little bit later. That night, Mark eventually arrived back at his Bateman Street flat. He looked up at the windows. No lights. Where was Jane? His neighbors told of Jane's decision to travel to London in case she was in danger. The next telephone call was one he would remember for the rest of his days. It was a call to his mother's house in Hampstead, where he was sure Jane was staying. An ecstatic Rosemary answered and brought Jane to the phone. She broke down in tears of relief to hear his voice. She had been convinced he was dead. She told Mark how she had left the flat soon after his abduction, as she dare not stay there and had traveled straight to London and then on to his mother's house on the first available train. She explained how she needed to be in a safe position until she could somehow find out more. She had not spoken to anyone about their work, and the hospital had no idea what had happened to the three of them. A few people near the flat that night had gone to the window because of the commotion in the street after the crash. They thought they must know the people in the other car and left it at that. The very next day, Mark took the same train journey to be with Jane and his mother, and of course dear Rosemary and David. It was a wonderful weekend for them all. On the Saturday, they spent the whole day in the garden with glorious weather. The Sunday was spent on a trip to the Thames, and they had all convinced dear Alice that she must come out with them to make it another perfect day. She did, and indeed it was. They had arrived back at the house late in the afternoon, and Alice went to her room in desperate need of a nap, so Mark and Jane left David and Rosemary chatting in the garden as they went inside and up to Mark's room. "Mark, what on earth are we going to do about the bomb?" questioned Jane. "I've tried not to think about it. It's just so wonderful our nightmare's over." "But that's it. That's just it, Mark. It isn't over. We know damn well there's an atom bomb under the Kremlin, especially from the evidence you've told me about this Grant fellow. It was admitted to be a fact, wasn't it, Mark? Look at me." Mark had lowered his head in despair. "I don't want anything else to do with it. I think we've both had enough, don't you?" "Certainly, but we can't leave it like this, hanging in midair, in limbo. People's lives may depend on what we know. It could even start bloody World War III, Mark. It could, couldn't it, for Christ's sake?" Mark looked up and into Jane's worried eyes. He didn't want it to be like this, still marring their relationship. All he wanted was to forget the whole thing, if he ever could, even his marvelous invention, and return to a normal life. "Jane," he said suddenly, "the machine, the bloody dream machine. It's still there in the lab I told you about. I should have destroyed it before I left." "It won't matter if they do think it's a special setup. Only you know how to work the thing." "Don't you believe it? There's some pretty smart people about. Besides, there are others who know what it does. Grant knows. Mike knows. Jane, that maniac Grant murdered a good doctor. even though he was a mercenary. And Ben, poor Ben, they kicked him to death, Jane. Oh my God. It's just not true. It's just unbelievable. It's for Ben and your doctor friend that we must see this through. Yes, we, Mark. We. Right. You're right, agreed Mark. I was just sticking my head in the sand, hoping it would all go away. Jane could see how shattered he was after all he had gone through. She knew full well that he had survived against tremendous odds at the hands of the evil Grant. She swore there and then to kill Grant one day. One day she might get the chance to do just that. It was owed to her. She cursed his name over and over again. Jane continued, Mark, listen to me. All that has to be done is to tell the authorities to check it out and look for the bomb. But my dear Jane, it's not as simple as that. Think about it. It was the Secret Services who engineered the whole plot. They mustn't know we know, or we'll end up like poor bloody Fraser in Davenport, silenced. They'll do anything, and I mean anything, to ensure this secret is kept secret. They've got to. It's a terrible thing they've done. He thought for a moment. What needs to be done is to get the bomb out without anyone knowing. It can be done. It must be done, or we can't rest. Now, the difficult bit, said Jane grimly. Who do we tell? Who can we ever know to trust? She remained deep in thought for a few moments. There is one, possibly just one, outside chance of pulling this off. What's that? Sighed Mark. This. Do you remember the face of the beautiful girl which kept appearing in Fraser's mind? We recorded on video, right? Right. Well, I've been applying some women's intuition to this, and I reckon Fraser was in love with her. Go on. Mark propped his head up on his elbows. Not only was he in love with her, but she could have been the Russian contact who knew how and where to plant the bomb. How am I doing, okay? Okay, Mark nodded. If by any chance she was in love with him, then surely she would be heartbroken to learn of his planned death after the job was done, and of course that he actually is dead. Yep. So where does this love story take us? Inquired Mark. It could take us to the bomb. But don't you think it's all a bit, well, far-fetched? But it's the only thing I can think of. Okay, well, let's assume your intuition is wholly correct. Exactly how would we ever find her? That is the problem, and problems are there to be solved, right? If you say so. Someone in MI5 or the CIA knows the name of this girl. If I'm right and she is working for them, all we need to do is find out her name and whereabouts, deduced Jane. Hey, that's a good point. If she's in the States or the UK, that makes it a whole lot easier to find her. But how? Through what channels without raising the suspicion of the organizations? There must be a way. We've just got to think of it. Jane felt pleased for having brought Mark around to her way of thinking. She smiled to herself. Mark kissed her as she sat on the edge of the bed.